Welcome, Dr. Bredesen. And if you say your name, maybe we'll get it actually right.
Bredesen rhymes with medicine.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madam Chairwoman, thank you very much. Members of the committee, thank you very much. Yes. Is that better? Okay. Let me pull this up for you so that I can show you some of our results. And there we go. There we go. So let me start by thanking you very much for the invitation today, and also thanking Alan Bortel, who arranged for me to speak today. And let me start by saying that the California Alzheimer's Disease Centers were established by you in 1984, and we are grateful. There are 10 of them in the state, and one of them is at UCLA, which is where I now am. And spend a part of time in Marin as well, as Mr. Levine said. So this is a situation, as you've mentioned, that has been one of the most difficult to address in medicine. And one could argue that, in fact, our greatest failure to date in medicine has been the inability to reverse neurodegenerative illnesses. So this is a major problem. And I want to show you something completely different today. I want you to forget for 10 minutes everything you've heard about Alzheimer's disease, and I want to show you that, in fact, what we're doing is breaking new ground. And, in fact, when you established these centers in 1984, as you know, the number one goal was to reduce the burden of Alzheimer's disease in the state of California, and, of course, hopefully everywhere. So, as you know, currently, the dogma here is that there is nothing that will prevent, reverse, or slow the progress of Alzheimer's disease. But I want to show you what now is coming from the Easton Center at UCLA, where we work on Alzheimer's disease. Here, as you can see, everyone knows someone who's a cancer survivor. No one knows an Alzheimer's survivor. So that's been the dogma. But part of the advantage of research is that it breaks new ground. It allows us to change the dogma, and that's what I want to show you today. And first, I want to show you a couple patients who have very typical Alzheimer's disease. And here's, there we go. Here is a physician that you'll see. And let's turn this up for a minute.
You were diagnosed in 2005. So
Yes.
it's already almost 3 years ago.
That's right.
Yeah. What made you even go to a doctor? And
I had an anger problem. My typical mild self turned into an ogre. My daughter had come to live with her kids with us. And it turned out that I just couldn't cope with the kids. I wasn't prepared to raise kids again, so it was natural for me to be angry. But my anger was out of control. I would really have spells of anger. And then the other thing that happened was that I was having spells, very briefly, of driving down a familiar street and suddenly being unable to remember where I was.
So immediately, this first person you can see, as you mentioned earlier, early stages, some behavioral changes, he would get upset. And this is a common thing. People get overwhelmed with things that they previously were able to do. Their work, in his case, taking care of his grandchildren. So the second thing, very classic again, spatial memory problems. So he had disorganization. He would get lost as he was driving. And I want to show you another person in just a moment who was almost identical to this, but who's now doing much, much better. So this second person was actually a big-time editor in Hollywood, and this is now further along in the illness.
Hey, Dad. What did you do for a living before you retired? Do you remember?
Yeah. I worked in Idaho. Big in Idaho spuds.
Do you remember working in Hollywood?
Oh, yes.
And did you know that you were like a big shot editor in Hollywood? Do Do you remember that?
Yeah.
So that is another strategy, as you can see. He just says yes to everything, and of course, if you actually dig down, there's nothing there. He doesn't remember what's going on. So as you already know, this is a major problem, both in the state of California, in the country, and actually worldwide. And in fact, if you look globally, there are 30 million patients who now have dementia. Within California, there are about 600,000 people who already have this illness. But the important number is one that we don't usually hear. That's because the people that we talk about who have it, this is because most of the people are too young to know that they have it. So although there are 5.2 million Americans who have Alzheimer's, if you ask the question, what about the 318 million Americans who are currently living? How many will get it? The answer is 45 million Americans who are currently alive will get this illness. And if you look at the 600,000 in California and ask, well, out of our entire state, how many will get it who are currently alive today? It's 5 million people. So this is an incredibly common problem and has now become actually the third leading cause of death. Just recently reported after cardiovascular disease and after cancer. So there are a number of people sitting here who either have it now or will get it. And the hope is that we will reverse that. And let me show you what we're doing along these lines. So in 2011, of course, President Obama signed into law the National Alzheimer's Project Act, and there have now been 2 summits. Unfortunately, there's still coming from these no significant treatment. If we do not do something about this, you look out here to 2050, we're talking about not only 160 million people globally, but also the end of our Medicare system with bankruptcy. So this is arguably the largest problem for our healthcare system. And I should point out, this is a problem in which women are at the epicenter of this epidemic. 65% of the patients, 60% of the caregivers, this is more common than breast cancer. Now, if you are a woman, your chance of getting Alzheimer's has now exceeded your chance of getting breast cancer. And of course, in disadvantaged communities, there are members who are at higher risk as well. So this is a major problem for all of us, with women at the center of this epidemic. And as I said, the Californians who are currently alive today, about 5 million, will develop this. And at the same time, if you ask, where are the cures? The answer is there are 0 of them. There are some medications, as you know, that have a very, very small effect. But this is a relatively modest effect. And in fact, if you look at the medications that are currently in phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, you can see a couple of things immediately. The first thing you see here is that they only fall into a couple of different groups. There aren't that many different targets being evaluated. The second thing you see is that every single one of these is a monotherapy. It's one thing. We already know with HIV that it took 3 different drugs to make a big impact. And yet here, all these trials are on single drugs. The second thing you'll see here is that everything that has an asterisk has already failed. In the last decade, we had 244 clinical trials, of which 243 failed, and 1 had a minimal impact. So these are difficult times, and if you look at the approved drugs here, they just fall into those 2 classes there. And just in the last few years, as I mentioned, 243 out of 244 trials have failed. And as you can see here, major problems. This particular one actually was developed by Lilly. And not only did it not make the disease better, it actually makes the disease worse. So something is fundamentally wrong with the way we are attacking this illness. So there is a sad state of affairs right now. For the patients, they often do not seek medical care because they've been told there's nothing that can be done. They fear loss of driver's license, the stigma of a diagnosis, inability to obtain long-term care, and ultimately nursing home placement. So what happens is they wait and wait and wait, which is the opposite of what needs to happen. Then they finally go to the primary care provider. Well, the primary care provider doesn't refer them to a specialist because they say, well, I can write a prescription for the drug that doesn't work very well, so why do I need to refer this patient? Often then, they don't have a firm diagnosis, so it's not clear that they actually have Alzheimer's. Then when they finally are sent to a specialist, the specialists often put the patients through hours of testing without helping them, expensive imaging, spinal taps. Who wants a spinal tap today? So, this is a real issue here. And then you end up with little or nothing to offer therapeutically. So this is a sad state of affairs indeed. So as I said, the current dogma is that there is nothing that will prevent reverse or slow the progress of Alzheimer's disease. But the support that you have given to the CADCs, to the California Alzheimer's Centers, is allowing us to look at whether we can change, we can challenge the dogma. That's the goal. What can we do to make things better? So we call this the therapeutic convergence. And if you look back in the 20th century, early on in the disease process versus late in the disease process, well, by the time that we could actually diagnose this, it was late in the disease process, and there was absolutely nothing you could do to change it. You could do things very early before you ever had it, things like nutrition, exercise, all the things that we're learning about, balance of hormones, all these things, but you didn't know that you had it. So in fact, there was no place here. Once you received the diagnosis, it was too late. Now, what's happening in the 21st century is a therapeutic convergence. In fact, with better and better research, better and better imaging techniques, better and better biomarkers, we're able to look earlier and earlier and earlier in the process itself. And at the same time, with all the epidemiological research, genetic research, and biochemical research, we're able to do something about it later and later. So for the first time now, we've reached a point, as I'll show you in the next few minutes, where we can see it early enough and we can change it. And the point here is that in the future, we want to take this obviously farther and farther and farther along so that we can do something. But already, it is now the time. We've been talking for many, many years about we really want to do something about this. We're finally there, and you are going to play a critical role in the upcoming years in looking at what we can do about this. And it starts in the state of California. So I want to show you now 3 different people. This is a 67-year-old woman who actually is from the East Coast, works for the government, and she had a 2-year history of progressive cognitive decline. Her mother had died with dementia, had started at the age of 62. This woman was very much like that first patient you saw. She was unable to navigate on the freeway. She would get lost. She couldn't remember what she had read. In fact, she'd start at the top of the page, and then she'd say when she got to the bottom, she'd have to start back at the top again. She was unable to prepare her reports for work. Thank you very much for the water. So she was unable to prepare her reports for work. And again, much like that first person you saw, she just couldn't organize things. She couldn't crunch the data and bring things together. She was unable to recall even 4-digit numbers. So in her work, she uses numbers very frequently. She could not recall these. And then she underwent a retinal scan that showed that it was very positive for amyloid. So again, the signature of Alzheimer's disease. And in fact, it was greater than a patient who had familial Alzheimer's disease. She was treated with what I'll describe to you today, which we call MEND, Metabolic Enhancement for Neurodegeneration. And you mentioned the paper earlier. We just have published the first paper on this back in September of 2014. And so what I'm going to show you over the next couple of minutes are a couple of interviews with these people. And you'll see that the faces are all blackened out. And you'll see also that, or they're pixelated in some cases and in some cases shaded, with the idea being that these people are back at work full time, and they understand that there's a stigma attached to having Alzheimer's disease. So they don't want people to know that they've been treated, but in fact they're doing extremely well. And out of as I mentioned in the paper we published, 6 out of the 10 were able to go back to work without problems. So this is the woman talking about her before and her after here. So tell me a little bit about how things were a year ago.
Well, a year ago, I was having a lot of difficulty. I was very frustrated because my memory was poor. I had issues of being spatially disoriented, particularly when I was driving. I would get off the freeway at the wrong exit or not know where I was getting back on familiar routes. I would reach in my house for a light switch. I'd reach on the wrong wall, even though I'd always had the light switch has always been on the right side. I'd start reaching to the left. I call my animals a different name, my pets, and I was really worried about it. I was very stressed about it. So it was a very stressful time.
And how are things at work?
I have a job that requires a lot of mental analysis, a lot of thinking. I do a lot of research. I have to collect data, and design the study, and then do the analysis and write a report, usually under pressure. And I was finding that I just couldn't complete an assignment. I couldn't think about the analysis. It was just a jumble to me, and I would start procrastinating and putting it off, and the longer I put it off, the more stress I felt. So I was worried that I was not going to be able to continue with my career.
And tell me a little bit about how things are now.
Things are much improved now. My memory is much better. In fact, I would even go so far as to say I don't think that I have a problem with memory now, which is a great surprise to me from where I was a year ago. My thinking, cognitive ability, and ability to do work, ability to do reports, I am back into the stream of things, being productive and being able to do my analysis and writing, which is fantastic.
And how's the driving?
Driving, no problem. I drive at night, I drive in the daytime. I know where to get off, where to get on. I'm on the highway, so I feel like that's a problem. I'm not reaching for the wrong side of the room for the light switch. I'm not calling my pets the wrong name, which I think they're probably grateful for.
And how overall are you feeling?
I feel great. I feel really, really good. I feel energetic. I feel more peaceful and calm about my life, but at the same time very enthusiastic. I've even started writing my book.
Fantastic.
A couple of chapters.
Okay, thank you very much. This woman is now just turning 71 this month. She's 3 years into this treatment, and she remains the way you see her here. And interestingly, 4 different times she's gone off this approach, off this program, once from traveling, once from running out of a few things, once from a viral illness, and all 4 times she had some decline, which then returned when she was back on it. I want to show you another man here. This person is a 70-year-old man with a 12-year history. He is ApoE4 positive, which is the most important genetic risk factor and is present in about 60% of all people with Alzheimer's disease. And in fact, if you look at the United States, 75 million Americans have this marker and therefore are at increased risk. If you have a single copy, it's a 3-fold increased risk. If you have 2 copies, 10 to 15-fold increased risk, and the majority of people will then get it. This one person had 1 copy, but had very classical Alzheimer's disease. So one of the things that's happened is that people don't want to know if they have the risk factor. But going forward, this is exactly the sort of program that needs to be there to see it coming and reverse it early. So this person had a PET scan that was very typical of Alzheimer's disease, showing 2 regions, the temporal region here on the side and the parietal region up the side here, with reduced utilization of glucose. He had neuropsych testing in 2003, 2007, and 2013, showing a very clear decline. And in fact, the California verbal learning test in this man decreased from 84th percentile to the 1st percentile, so he had very poor memory. He was unable to remember the combination of his lock. He's unable to remember faces, people he'd been with, his schedule. He had difficulty at work, also difficulty, interestingly, with numbers. His whole life, he'd been able to add columns of numbers very rapidly and get an answer very quickly. And he lost that during this, and he got it back on the treatment. So he's doing very, very well. It took him about 6 months to improve, was able to remember his coworkers again, his schedule, faces, and interestingly, he got back the ability to add numbers. But what his wife told me was very interesting. She said, yes, he's clearly improved. She said, but the more important thing is that actually he had been declining in an accelerated fashion for the year or 2 before this started, and that completely halted before he started getting better. So he talks a little bit here about his story.
And went to open the locker at my gym, and I could not remember the combination, which is, as I know myself, that'd be very unusual. And I would meet with my accountant, say, and we would just toss out some numbers, and I would have the number faster than he could get to his computer usually. So things like that started to wane dramatically. Clearly, I mean, the math has come back. That's a real measurable thing. I mean, I'm fast with math again. People I had met, maybe even taken to lunch, I did not know who they were. I mean, it's like a new encounter. And then afterwards, they'd say, you actually know this person. So that's gone away, which is a relief.
So one of the things that he said during his interview was that he's allowed himself to think about the future again. he had given up on the future, and he's able to think about his grandchildren and what he's going to be doing with his grandchildren and things like that. So it was very exciting. And one last one I want to show you here. This is just to come back to what you said earlier. If you're 45, you got to be thinking about 55, and if you're 55, you got to be thinking about 65. So this is a 55-year-old attorney with a 4-year history, and her memory loss was quite severe, and she actually approached one of the researchers in our laboratory and said, "Could you help me? My memory has really gotten horrible." She would leave the stove on and then go out and be horrified when she came back home and saw the stove there. She would record conversations because she couldn't remember things. And in fact, her children started something where they would do this, saying, "Dad and the 4 kids are on one paragraph and Mom's on a different paragraph trying to catch up with us." So it was actually quite unfortunate. She would carry an iPad to note everything, but then she forgot how to get into the iPad. So it was having major problems. She was unable to practice or to learn new information. She had been trying to learn Spanish unsuccessfully. She would get lost in mid-sentence in talking to her children. And interestingly, what she showed is that you have to continue with the therapy. You start with one phase, you add to it. It's not just give a pill, go home. And she did very, very well at that. So she's back at work, learning new areas of law. She learned Spanish after all, and she brought in her iPad and said, "I brought it just out of force of habit, but I don't need it anymore."
I couldn't remember conversations that I'd had with my kids and my husband. I started having to refer to my calendar all the time. I had to rely on it or I'd forget appointments. My son showed me how to unlock my iPhone. And by the next day, I could not remember what he had shown me. So there was one particular moment when I knew my memory was improving. And I was out with my husband and we were having a conversation. And I remembered names before he did. I actually corrected memory that he had, make minor corrections. I remembered it more vividly than he did. And that had not happened in years. So I think that's when I knew that my memory was really recovering.
This is just a summary of the first 10 patients that we published back in September. 9 of them have shown improvement. So if you just stop for a moment and think, what would a California with dementia rates really slashed to the bone look like? The job situation would be different. There wouldn't be the demand for so many caregivers to put in countless hours where they are not paid. The families wouldn't be broken up the way they are. The tremendous burden on costs for the state wouldn't be what they are. And most importantly, several of us who are destined to get this would still be doing very well and would have a full life. So this would be a hugely different scenario, and that's what we want to do in the future with your help. So if you look at why, what is going on here and how are we trying to address this? What we're looking at is no different than what's been done with cardiovascular disease, no different than what's been done with cancer, no different than what's been done with other chronic illnesses such as osteoporosis. So if you take as an example osteoporosis, very well studied, as you know, when you are younger, you have a beautiful balance between the cells that make the bone, the osteoblasts, and the cells that pick up the bone, the osteoclasts. Now, imagine for a moment that you have your osteoclasts doing more activity, which is what happens as you get older. And this would be just like if you had a contractor working at your house. You've got one that does the demolition, and you've got one that does the construction. Now imagine that for 20 years, the one who did the demolition always did extra, and the one that did the construction never showed up at all. Your house would start getting smaller and smaller. And that's exactly what's happening in the case of osteoporosis, and that's exactly what's happening in Alzheimer's disease. If you look at cancer, interestingly, the same sort of story, but now we're on the other side of the curve, the cytoblastic. In other words, the thing that's making more cells, the signals, now exceed because you have smoked too much or you've been exposed to chemical carcinogens or what have you. That, and of course in your genetic background, add up to make it so that you get an imbalance. So just like the imbalance in osteoporosis, now you have an imbalance between making cells and turning them over. So Alzheimer's disease in our model is no different. That in fact there are many signals that lead to what we call synaptoblastic activity. So this is making and storing memories. You're actively doing this all the time. You're actively forgetting the seventh song that played on the radio on the way to work yesterday, and you're actively remembering that that door keeps opening and closing a lot while we're talking. So and you're actively remembering where your keys are and what you're going to do next today and all that sort of stuff. So unfortunately, when you have Alzheimer's, the synaptoclastic signals exceed the synaptoblastic signals for years, typically for 20 years or more. Well, that gives us a leg up. We can now look earlier and earlier and earlier and do something about it. You don't want to be on the wrong side for years, and you don't want to wait when you recognize that you are. So then we look and say, okay, what are all the things that create that balance? Well, the good news, we identified 36 of them, and here are many, many things you can see. Many things, this is just actually a small group, all related to this balance. So no surprise, it has to do with many things. In other words, your good brain health is a symphony. And we're not going to give you just the French horns to make you better. We're not going to give you just the timpani. We've got to get the entire symphony. We've got to get the entire orchestra. So what I tell people is, imagine that you have a roof with 36 holes in it. Now, the drug company is going to give you something really good, and no question, drugs are critical for this illness. But we want to have a foundation on which to give them. We want to cover the other 35 holes. Then the drug will really show you whether it's doing what it's supposed to. When you use it and you leave the other 35 holes uncovered, guess what? No big surprise, you don't see much. So you want to cover many of these. And the program that I showed you with these people getting better covered all 36 holes. And we don't have the best cover for any of them yet. We're still working on that. But it's a beginning, and the results are dramatic. So what we're understanding is that here we are on the left here. This is Western medicine. We're really good with understanding DNA. We're really good with reductionism. We're really good with mechanisms. We're not so good with the whole symphony. The traditional Chinese medicine physicians were really good with the whole patient. But of course, they knew nothing about DNA. They knew nothing about proteins, about genomics, any of these things. So the key is you need to bring these together. This is the future, so that we have a form of medicine where we can bring the best. And a lot of this, of course, a lot of these mechanisms have come directly from the state of California and the many wonderful institutions and biopharm companies that are doing this. So lots of questions to answer here, a lot of things we don't know yet. How late in the course is this approach effective? How long can the therapeutic benefit be sustained? We know that the first woman I showed you, she's now 3 years in, doing absolutely great. The second guy, the guy I showed you actually is 1.5 years, doing great. The third woman is now 2 years, and she's doing great. Are there subtypes? One of the things that we've noticed is that with these various people, we immediately see that they fall into at least 3 groups, what we call hot Alzheimer's, cold Alzheimer's, and cortical Alzheimer's. They're very different. They act differently. They respond differently. And I think many people have argued that, in fact, Alzheimer's is not one disease. There are subtypes that we can tease out. And then, is this program effective in familial Alzheimer's? There's a smaller group, but the question is whether it would be helpful. And then, would an analogous approach be effective for other neurodegenerative illnesses? Parkinson's, Lewy body disease, and there are 1 million people in the United States with Lewy body disease, very common. Frontotemporal degeneration, progressive supranuclear palsy, ALS, and other neurodegenerative illnesses. Would this sort of approach be ultimately useful for these as well? And then ultimately, might this program serve as a platform on which to test these wonderful new drugs that are coming out of the pharmaceutical companies that would otherwise potentially fail as monotherapeutics? So let me just end by telling you a story, a true story, an ongoing story that's actually remarkable. So there's a woman, another one in the group here, and I should go back here. Let's go back here. So this is a woman who lives on the East Coast, and when she was 49 years of age, she began to have very similar problems to the ones you've just seen. And she did things like put food that was supposed to go in the refrigerator, she'd put it on the shelf, and then her husband would find it later. She had difficulties with her memory. Very typical story that you've seen on Still Alice, you've seen on Away from Her, and all these sorts of movies. And she didn't realize initially that the problem was Alzheimer's because she was only 49 years old. But she actually underwent genetic testing because her son had a genetic problem. And she wanted to know if she had the gene for what her son had. Well, she was very unhappy to find out that she had ApoE4 2 copies, and that in fact she was exhibiting early signs of early Alzheimer's disease. And when she told her husband this, he said, that explains a lot. He knew there was something wrong, but again, as we so typically do, he didn't want to say anything. It's always put it off, put it off, put it off. So they moved from the big city back to her hometown where she had grown up, a small town, to die. She moved there for care, to be around her family. She ended up actually surfing the internet, looking at all sorts of different things, and she went on something virtually identical to what the three people went on. She's now 52. She had documented her decline by showing on the internet that she was scoring at the 30th percentile for her age on cognition tests. She now scores 98th percentile, and she did this without any further practice. So she didn't just get good at the test. She went on this program. She got back to normal. She's now 3 years out. She's now 52. And so she started a website. And the website is for people with this genetic predisposition, and they're from all over the world. And a couple of dozen of them are now coming out to California in 3 weeks to get on this program. So this is a first, to get people who know they are at risk to jump in very early on and to get them on this sort of program. This is the future. So just to summarize, these patients who are struggling at work or having to terminate their employment were able to return to work or continue their work. Improvement's been sustained with actually now up to 3 years. None of the patients, interestingly, was able to follow the entire protocol. It's got 36 different parts. It's very complicated. People complain about it. But the fact of the matter is there's a threshold. And this is no different than what's happened in cardiovascular disease. You get your HDL good enough and your LDL low enough, you get out there and do all these things, you start picking up the plaques instead of putting them down. So you actually start seeing some reversal. No different here. So this program, which we call MEND, for Metabolic Enhancement for Neurodegeneration, is personalized. It's designed to address the many contributors to the plasticity network that are imbalanced in Alzheimer's disease, as well as serving as a platform for novel drug candidate testing. And continued iteration, both for the patient and for the system, is optimal. So in other words, you just don't get a pill and go home. You keep on coming back and you keep on making improvements. So is Alzheimer's disease incurable? Well, one of my favorite quotes is from Margaret Mead, who said, "Never doubt the ability of a small group of committed individuals to change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." And this group is just such a group. So thanks once again for hearing me today, and thanks once again for all the good work, and thank you on behalf of all the CADCs. Thank you on behalf of UCLA and the Easton family for your support for Alzheimer's.
Thank you. And I think that instead of clapping, we should give him that was absolutely one of the best presentations I've heard, and especially on this subject.
Thank you.
My grandmother died with Alzheimer's, and my mother had something else. It was a dementia, but it was different because she had small strokes. And we figured that that's what finally created her problems. And so I always worry about that because they say that it's something that could be passed down. So thank you so much for coming. Thank each one of you for staying and listening and being a part of this. Are there any comments that you would like to make, Ms. Lopez? You have to put your mic up. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's a great presentation, and and now we can really educate our community to not be afraid, to speak about it, especially in the Latino community. Sometimes I have my mom is 86 years old, and sometimes, she pretended she catch everything conversation back, and sometimes I notice that, maybe she's not have that diagnostic right now, but maybe she has.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think this is the beginning of a change. I think that just as we changed in the way that we saw cardiovascular disease over 30 years ago, thanks to people like Dr. Dean Ornish and so many others, Dr. Esselstyn and Colin Campbell and so many others who've worked in that area, We're looking at changing. Obviously, cancer rates are changing as people understand more that what is driving this illness. And I think that we're going to see the same thing with dementia.
Thank you. Did I have any questions to ask?
I didn't pose any questions.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.